Hello and welcome to the first chapter of this comprehensive course on photography, and today I am going to give you a brief introduction on exposure and stop value. You must have heard about the term exposure triangle a lot. They say it's the base of photography, which is correct. But to understand the exposure triangle, let's understand the meaning of exposure first. Now, exposure can have different meanings in photography, but to understand the exposure triangle, pay attention to this one particularly. Your camera needs light to function. Exposure means exposing the sensor of your camera to light. Now, the main factor here is how much your camera's sensor is exposed to light. It will directly determine how the final image is going to come out. The more light the sensor receives, the brighter your image is going to be. And if it receives a little too much light, you will get a white bleached image with bad colors and shadows, lacking details. On the other hand, if it receives less light, the result will be a very dark image with, again, fewer details. An ideal exposure will give you proper tones in your photograph. The highlights and shadows will have details and the colors will come out crisp. Now the question is, what is an ideal exposure? It is said that when all the tones in an image are properly exposed and have details in them, when the exposure meter is right in the middle on 0, it's a finely exposed image, perfectly exposed image. But frankly, an ideal exposure change in every situation. There can be situations in which we purposely want a darker image, and then there can be situations in which we purposely want a brighter image. But that is a topic we cover in the upcoming videos. Now learn these terminologies. A darker image is called underexposed image and a brighter image is called overexposed image. There is a way to read exposure in numbers as well. How do we do that? Well, there is an exposure meter inside your camera and it looks like this. Come on, pick up your camera and see for yourself. Let's work on it practically. Pay attention to the exposure meter over here. The more it is towards the left, the darker will be the image. This is on -1, this is on -2, and this is on -3. And the more it is towards the right, the brighter will be the image. This is on +1, +2, and +3. Now, next time when you get a bleached photograph or a little too dark one, check this meter. It will tell you where you messed up and by how many stops. Before we move further, if you're still watching this video and wish to be part of the course, consider subscribing the channel so that you can receive updates whenever I upload the next video. On this note, let me introduce you to another term called stop. Stop is basically a way of monitoring increment and decrement in light falling on your camera's sensor. In a wider sense, it's monitoring the exposure. This +1, +2 and +3, -1, -2 and -3 that you see here in the exposure meter show the stops of exposure. You must have heard of people saying add a stop of light or reduce a stop of light. This is the stop that they are talking about. From 0 to +1, you add a stop of light. From +1 to +2, you add 2 stops of light, and then +3 is 3 stops of light. Similarly, if you go towards the negative side, you reduce the stops of light. Understand it like this. A stop brighter is basically doubling the amount of light hitting the sensor, and a stop darker is reducing that light by half. Now, here is something that confuses a lot of people. So I'm going to lay it out clear in this video. From 0 to +1, the sensor is receiving 2 times the light. But from +1 to +2, it's not receiving 2 times the amount of light. It's receiving 4 times the amount of light it was getting on 0. And on +3, it's receiving 8 times the amount of light because increment by 1 stop is doubling the light. Apart from these full stop increments and decrements, you have 2 intermediate stops as well. It's not like every time you have to increase or decrease the exposure by 1 full stop. Also, there are chances that in your camera, you might have to go in the settings and use this particular option to access these intermediate stops. So if that's the case, make sure you select the 1/3 option here. Apart from the exposure meter, the increments in ISO, shutter speed and aperture also happen in stops. So everything coming up next in this chapter will be discussed in terms of stops. So watch the video again if you want to, but make sure the concept of stop is clear in your mind. And now when you know about exposure, stops and meter, then you should know that there is a way to control it too and set it up as per your requirement. So for that, stay tuned for the next video.